Hello, I'm Josie Long, writer, stand-up comedian and museum enthusiast. We're currently hovering 12 feet above the ground at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford. It's a truly unique place, which brings together an unfathomably large number of objects from around the world, every one with a story to tell. And that's what we're here to discover through the staff and volunteers who make this place tick, day in, day out, as they share their favourite objects, personal picks and hidden gems. So join us as we delve deep into this incredible collection and explore stories from the Pitt Rivers Museum.
It's like no other museum that you will ever have been to.
There's like layers of objects, so many layers. It's like a stratigraphy of objects. And this is where a lot of sort of the hidden gems have come out because they've been buried underneath other objects for so long.
I'm Ashley Kutu and I'm a research fellow at the Pitt Rivers Museum. This is a salt cellar and it is carved from elephant ivory. It's one of these objects that I do feel people miss in the case. So because it's at, knee height, I thought it was a great object to highlight.
I love the idea that there's like different museums. There's the child height museum and there's the adult height museum and then there's the rooting through the drawers museum, and there's just so many different ways to interact with it.
This would have been a tooth of an elephant for 70 years or so, and then it gets carved at the end of the elephant's life into this masterful work. In many ways, for me, it's much more interesting to take an object like this and talk to children about endangered species and talk to them about how they're kind of snapshots of a very specific relationship of these communities with elephant ivory that's very different than what we see later on when elephant ivory gets really exploited.
It's more controversial now as a material, and rightly so, obviously.
Absolutely.
I know that part of your work is about researching the elephants themselves. How do you go about that from an object like this?
So all of the molecules, the biomolecules, are essentially preserved in this carving because it is a tooth. So looking at things like trace elements and DNA, we can learn about the life of that animal.
I'm Laura van Broekhoven and I'm the director of the Pitt Rivers Museum. When people come into the Pitt Rivers Museum, you have that sort of overwhelmed feeling, which for some people feels like, oh, wow, I can now just sort of go into and rummage around. While for other people, it makes them really uncomfortable, especially for indigenous communities. Many of them actually, they will come in and they say, okay, I need to leave. I can't be here. It takes my breath away. I can't breathe. And so I think that is where we're sort of trying to be more conscious of how the museum has different effects on different people.
Wow, that's so interesting. Because I'm somebody for whom it's just such a thrill. And it's because it works for me. And of course, this is how lots of mindsets work. Because it works for me, I was like, well, it's a good thing then, isn't it? Universally. But no, of course. One of the reasons that I love the Pitt Rivers so much is there's so many quirks in it of humanity and belief and things that you feel also have a little bit of fun to them, mischievousness as well. I'd like to sort of now talk about something a little bit different, which is a bottle that's got a witch in it. I'm here with Mara Gold, who is a research assistant as part of the Beyond the Binary project.
So the old lady, living in a village near Hove, Sussex, by whom it was obtained about 1915, remarked, "They do say there be a witch in it, and if you let him out, there'll be a peck o' trouble." There's this kind of thought that a lot of the people prosecuted for witchcraft were actually part of the LGBTQ community. My role was to look at the existing collections and see maybe which objects we could bring LGBTQIA stories out of. So a lot of the other witch bottles that exist were to ward away witches and witchcraft, and often they were supposedly filled with the urine of the victims, and that supposedly would cause harm to the witch until she lifted the curse. So one, I find it interesting that a lot of these anti-witch measures were actually spells and kind of witchy things themselves. So I find that quite ironic. But secondly, this bottle is different in that it supposedly contained the actual ghost of a witch. In England, the tradition was that, it was mainly these women that were being kind of accused of being witches. So it's interesting that this one contains a male witch. So, maybe he's a gay witch. Who knows?
You could see the Pitt Rivers Museum as a place that really has a world of stories within it. But right now, it's very much sort of through the Eurocentric, male, patriarchal eye, one could say. And I think that has a lot to do with, what the history is of the museum. You'll see in the labels written on the objects, but also in the stories that were collected with the objects, was mostly the people who went out to collect them. They felt they were entitled to speak about them. It's one of the things that we're trying to undo today.
My name is Rebecca, and I'm doing an 18-month cloth workers funded internship at the Pitt Rivers Museum. So I'm looking at a collection of objects that we hold in drawers in the court space with all the cabinets. My project is to redisplay and curate and sort of reinterpret those spaces. So we opened up this drawer and we kind of looked at it and went, is it one of those fish? And we're like, it is a magic fish. If you think back to Christmas Day and you pull the cracker and a red cellophane fish would fall out of it. So it's basically a very old version of one of those. So the ones that tell you if you're fickle or you're guilty, they used to scare me lots when I was small. It wasn't being supported in the best way. It was laid on this very soft wadding. So I was like, oh, we're going to have to do something about that because it could move around.
Well, yeah, that's its raison d'etre.
Yeah.
Magic fish, which undergoes contortions under influence of warmth and moisture of the hand, used by Donner's father circa 1818 to detect culprits among his children through its behaviour on the palm of the hand. They greatly dreaded its power of detecting the guilty. Dunfermline, Fifeshire, and it was Mrs. D. O. Hill, 1898. I mean, what a label, firstly. This completely blows my mind because it's not the sort of object that I would imagine to be something that was around 200 years ago. It seems so modern and frivolous.
There's quite a long, sort of deeply rooted history of folklore in this country. It's amazing, so rich. This is a perfect object that sort of captures that. It was owned by someone called Thomas Nelson Annandale, a well-known Scottish surgeon, so a man of science, and he had this amazing fish.
It really shocks me that this person was a prominent surgeon, and yet what has lasted of them is a little fortune-telling fish that they used to terrify their children.
Yeah.
I'm speaking with Jem Uden, who is the head of conservation at the Pitt Rivers Museum.
One of my main areas of research is onto pesticide residues on objects, as many were sprayed with different types of pesticide in an effort to preserve them. Actually, that may be why quite a lot of these objects are still here, because they're still toxic to moth. They still have mercury and arsenic and DDT residues on them. And it's kind of the more recent acquisitions that weren't given those treatments that are more badly affected. We check our moth traps once a week and we have them all in a grid around the museum so we can triangulate where the moth numbers are increasing and work out what's infested so we can freeze it immediately to prevent damage.
That's heartbreaking. It could survive a voyage around the entire world. It could survive centuries and wars, and then moths get it. It's a banquet. I've never been more angry at moths. What is this incredible object?
This is a Tahitian mourner's costume. I spent probably about 300 or 400 hours altogether actually stabilising this costume and making it possible to display it in the way that it's displayed now. We're not restorers, we're not trying to make these things look like new. Some water would remove the tissue that I've used to repair the bark cloth and it would be back to how it was before I found it. And that's also quite important.
What do we know about the ceremony?
Well, we know that the chief mourner was armed with a sword that had shark's teeth. He was allowed to kill anyone he came across. People were afraid of him, they would run away from him. And so he represented, I think, this really powerful figure.
Sort of supernatural.
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, you were actually looking at the divine, you were looking at a god.
Today, we're seeking to bring in communities who are knowledge keepers to bring more meaningful understanding into the museum. And what they will say is that these objects, for them, have life. They need to be danced to, they need to be given food and water, and which obviously are all the things that, museums and conservators will try to keep out.
I'd not even thought prior to this that the mindset of, well, look, they're in a case, they're all very safe, is not the same as respecting something in a different culture. It's like, for so long, this museum was hiding in plain sight. Like, the real stories of the objects were all just there. And instead it was, this person found this in this place. Aren't they brilliant?
Hi everyone, I'm Marinka Thompson-Odla. I'm a research associate at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and I work on the Labeling Matters project.
What are we looking at the moment?
A pair of salmon-skin boots, exactly what they sound like. And they're made by the Ainu people, who are indigenous people of Japan. On the label of these, you can see that it says purchased in 1900. This is like one of the few times within the Pitt Rivers collection that we actually have the indigenous terms. And you can see here it says shepker, which literally means boot made out of salmon. We are very much kind of tied into a box of interpretation through text, right? Because that's what we privilege in our society, right? You go to school, you learn from books. You go to university, you learn from more books. We have to think of various ways to really, speak about these objects. So one of the ways is short film. And I met a Japanese artist and researcher named Eiko Soga. And a few years ago, she'd done a video on the making of these salmon skin shoes. Just for an example of how I think video can even take you further into these boots, is that within it, there's this one fly. And so there's little unexpected things jolt you out of the museum case and into the actual making and setting of these things. So I grew up in the Caribbean on a small island, St. Lucia, surrounded by water, right? So fish is a big part of my diet. So it was just interesting because it really put me back into that fish market, or even any of the fishermen selling the fish on the side of the road, because just fish and flies just go hand in hand. That fly, although unexpected, is familiar. And so it just made the whole process familiar to me. We're a museum that has objects from so many cultures. So then why are we trying to talk about these objects in a way that may not even be conducive or compatible with their creation in the first place?
There's so many different ways of being and knowing, and how do we unlock those stories? For a long time, those stories were told from one perspective. And I think that is really the challenge that we see for curating the Pitt Rivers Museum. There's this sort of colonial complicity almost in the contemporary of us as museums. And that is where, when we are entering into those relationships with indigenous communities or people living in diaspora here in the UK or elsewhere, you might need to really sort of be very open and to the fact that there will be a lot of pain in that conversation, and that there might be a consequence of that. Some objects might need to go back.
Yes, it's so wonderful to think that with further understanding, and as museums themselves evolve, that actually they can get better and better by truly connecting with the people behind the things and asking for understanding, as opposed to sort of deciding on knowledge.